Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. My name is Karen Spring, and I'm the Honduras-based coordinator for the Honduras Solidarity Network. The network is includes over 30 organizations from Canada and the United States, and we formed the network shortly after the 2009 military coup in Honduras, and we focus on examining the role of the United States and Canada in what's going on in Honduras. I myself have lived in Honduras, lived and worked in Honduras since 2009, so almost over 10 years, and I work on human rights issues and supporting grassroots movements and organizations, once again focused on the role of the United States and Canada in the country. I'm very sorry that I cannot be with you today in person. Obviously, being in person is much better than looking at a screen and hearing me speak to you that way. And I do apologize, and thank you very much for the patience for the patience of the organizers and people that worked really hard to organize events. I unfortunately had to leave and go back to Honduras earlier than I thought because of a personal situation with my partner, who is Honduran, Edwin Espinal, and he's been a political prisoner. He was in a maximum security prison for almost 19 months, and he was released a little over a month ago on August 9th. And we just found out that the government of Honduras wants to send him back to prison. And because he was in a maximum security prison for so long, he has a whole series of healthcare problems that we really need to address, especially considering now that they might try and send him back. We were waiting for the resolution of the courts, but as many people know, we can't depend on the court system in Honduras because there's really no rule of law. And the government of Honduras is increasingly cracking down on anybody that speaks out, anybody that protests, and so we're really concerned that he might be sent back to prison, and so that's why I had to head back early, and that's why I'm not with you today, and I apologize for that. While I'm on the topic of my partner, I thought I'd explain a little bit more about his case, why he's in prison or why he was in prison, and then how it links to what's going on in the country, the crisis that is sort of continuing to unfold in Honduras and causing so many people to flee to the U.S. border, which is something that when I come to the United States and Canada, you don't really hear anything about. We don't hear about the root causes. We don't hear about people asking, well, why are these people even fleeing in the first place? What's making Hondurans make these difficult decisions as to flee to the border and walk, hundreds of miles to the U.S. border? And so my partner's case is a good way of sort of talking about the crisis that's going on in Honduras. So basically, the caravans in Honduras started, in October of last year in 2018. But Hondurans have been fleeing the country for years, but individually. And then the caravans started, and the caravans came shortly after the 2017 electoral crisis in Honduras. That was in November of 2017. And what happened is the Hondurans went to the polls. Hondurans decided, participated in their general elections, which occur every 4 years, and thousands of Hondurans, millions, went to the polls, and they wanted to cast their vote, hoping that there would be some sort of change in the country, change in their daily realities, changes in the policies that have driven so many of them to flee the country, which I'll talk about later. And there was widespread fraud. The computer systems all of a sudden crashed, and crashed while the leader of the opposition was winning. And then when the computer systems came back on, all of a sudden the presidential candidate that was running for illegal re-election, Juan Orlando Hernandez, was all of a sudden winning. And so in response, thousands of Hondurans took to the streets to protest the fraud, to defend their votes. And as a result, state security forces cracked down on protests, and they started opening firing on protesters. Over 30 people were killed, and dozens were sent to prison. Some of them were released shortly after, but then around over 30 people remained in prison for a long period of time, most of them in maximum security prisons, like my partner, Edwin Espinal, who is one of the longest standing political prisoners, but was finally released. But there are actually still 8 people that are imprisoned. And so the 2017 electoral crisis sparked once again another crisis in Honduras, and Honduras has remained in a constant crisis since the 2009 military coup that was supported by the United States government and the Canadian government. And that's not something you hear about when you talk about the root causes as to why people are fleeing Honduras. It was backed by the United States and backed by the Canadian government, and it's basically sparked and been one of the root causes as to why Honduras continues to spiral into a crisis in the last 10 years. And the 2017 electoral crisis was just another crisis in the country where Hondurans were trying to change their reality, trying to say, you know what, we can't handle what's been going on in the country. We want a change of government. We want to change the political party that's in power, the National Party that's been in power since the coup. And they were told basically, nope, you can't. Where the United States government and the Canadian government came out and supported the fraud. They recognized the election results, ignored the widespread allegations of fraud, and said we are going to recognize the government of Juan Orlando Hernandez. And basically, since then, Hondurans have remained in the streets. They have been protesting and protesting constantly. They've been protesting the fact that the government has absolutely no legitimacy in the country, that the only reason that it's maintained itself in power is because of U.S. and Canadian support, and that Hondurans no longer want the president to be in power. And so there's been constant protests that have sort of maintained themselves for different issues. Every single day there's different protests for different reasons. And it's the way Hondurans are trying to change their reality. For the Hondurans that want to stay in the country, that don't flee, they are confronted with bullets on the streets when they protest. They are murdered if they say anything against the government, or they're thrown in maximum security prisons like my partner. I refer to the case of Berta Cáceres, the well-known environmental indigenous activist who was murdered in her home in 2016 for being a very vocal opponent against the government and for defending indigenous lands from the illegal construction of hydroelectric dams on indigenous territories. She herself was murdered in her home for her vocal opposition to the government's policies. And she is another example of what happens to people when they speak out against the government and when they stay in the country and try and change their reality. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about protests that are going on today in Honduras. Just 2 days ago, there were 2 or 3 days ago, there was a protest in Tegucigalpa, the capital city, where people were defending their water resources, their water source in the capital city that's under threat. There's massive water shortages in Tegucigalpa they've now implemented a very strict rationing of water. And so people were taking to the streets and protesting because the mayor of Tegucigalpa, who's part of the National Party as well, the government in power, basically handed over a whole big section of this National Reserve Park that is the source of water for a large part of the capital city to this rich developer who wants to build very luxurious homes for the rich, basically, that want to live inside a beautiful forest that happens to be a natural reserve that should be protected. And so people in Honduras took to the streets saying, no, you're threatening our water source, stop the construction of this project. And they were met by bullets and tear gas. And they were shot at by state security forces, by police, by military, that I should mention are funded, trained by the U.S. government. And And so another example of what happens when with people that stay in the country to try and change the reality is for example, there was in April of this year, there were widespread protests around the country against the privatization of healthcare and education. And so high school students actually are some of the strongest forces that are protesting the privatization of public education. These are students that are, the majority of Hondurans don't have the ability to pay the high cost for private education, and so they depend on the public healthcare or the public healthcare and education system. And so high school students between the ages of 14 and 18 were taking to the streets and protesting. And I actually was in one of the protests one day in the La Kennedy neighborhood in the capital city. And I was there all day watching as high school students they would, instead of going into their classrooms and going to school like, you would if you were in the United States or Canada, you show up and you go in and you have your whole day of classes. High school students were saying, no, we need to defend our education system. So instead of going into the classrooms, we're going to go onto the road and we're going to block the road and we're going to create sort of traffic and, this is our way of protesting to say no to privatization of our education system. And so high school students were doing that, and state security forces, police and military would come in and either open fire on them, live bullets, or they would tear gas them. And so this sort of went on the entire day. And you can imagine what happens when young people between the 16, 18-year-olds, take on police forces. I mean, high school students have way more energy than any police and military, that's like 20, 30 years old would have. So they sort of maintain this pattern of going in, blocking the road, being evicted by a huge amount of tear gas, and then leaving for an hour and then going back to the road, blocking the road, then being evicted again by police and military, and then dispersing, and then coming back again to block the road. And this went on all day, this cat and mouse game. But in the end of it, at the end of the day, around 5 o'clock, I was around the area where the evictions were happening and just sort of, watching about what was going on as a human rights observer and defender. And these high school students kind of walked up to me and they had these big plastic bags of tear gas canisters, and they started to show them to me, and they said, okay, there's about 4 different types of tear gas that they threw at us today that they were firing at us, and they wanted to show me that every single tear gas canister said on it, made in the United States. And so these high school students said to me, well, look instead of purchasing or buying and taking this money and putting it into our education system and buying our books or, lowering the costs that our parents have to pay to put us in public education, the government of Honduras is buying tear gas from U.S. companies, and U.S. companies are profiting and taking our money that should be going into public services for us. They're profiting and making money off of the fact that we're being repressed and tear gassed by our own government. And this is the words of high school students in Honduras. These are not my words. And so they wanted to show me that as a foreigner, and they assumed that I was American. And they wanted to make that point that U.S. companies are profiting off of the situation in Honduras, the repression, the violence that the government is using against people that are staying in the country and trying to change the reality of daily life in Honduras. And that's not the only example. So another example is, the daily reality of Hondurans has dramatically changed in the 10 years that I've lived in Honduras. And I've sort of watched the situation deteriorate over 10 years. And it has a lot to do with the interests of U.S. companies. So, for example, the National Electrical Energy Company in Honduras that was publicly owned and managed by the government, 4 years ago, was privatized. And a lot of the companies that received the contracts to build dams, to generate electricity, to then be distributed to Honduran households, are U.S. companies that receive concessions to build hydroelectric dams that many communities in Honduras protest and don't want because they deeply affect their water supplies. So the National Electrical Energy Company was privatized, and that has meant that energy prices, so the amount of money that I pay on my monthly electrical bill, has dramatically increased. So just in 2 years, my energy bill has more than doubled. And I'm not a Honduran family that is trying to make ends meet, making minimum wage, which is around $300, 300 US dollars a month, trying to, pay these increased energy prices. And it's not just energy prices that have gone up, and it's not just, gas prices have gone up, which has meant that food prices have significantly increased, because so often the standard food basket is very much pegged to how much gas prices are in the country. Gas prices, you pay more at the pumps in Honduras, over double of what you pay here in the United States. And so another example of how daily life in Honduras has changed in the last 10 years is, the healthcare system in Honduras has been so severely depleted in the last 10 years that, granted, it was never perfect when I got there 10 years ago. Honduras is a poor country, so it's a struggle to maintain a good healthcare system, but it was much better 10 years ago before the 2009 coup than it is now. And an example of that is when Hondurans go to, be stitched up, or when they have they break their arm and they need a cast, or when they need cancer treatment or dialysis. For kidney problems, they're going into the hospitals, and the doctors are saying, well, you know what, I'm sorry, we can't provide medical treatment for you because we don't have any supplies. So you need to go and you need to buy the needle, and you need to buy the thread to stitch that wound up. You need to buy the medication that's required to freeze the area. You need to buy the bandages. You need to buy the cast. You need to buy all of that stuff before we can treat you. And so Hondurans are saying, well, we didn't have these costs before of living, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that, the government is totally neglecting the healthcare system, but at the same time, the government, and this is proven, and I'll explain it later, that there are key people in the government and key mafia structures in the government of Honduras that are actually stealing thousands of dollars from the healthcare system. And so the money's not going into investing in healthcare and education, and subsidies for energy costs for the regular Honduran family, but that's money that's being stolen from the Honduran people. And or money that is, instead of investing in healthcare and education, the Honduran government is giving these services to private companies in the United States and Canada to provide these services, and that's causing profits for these companies, these transnationals and these foreign companies, but it's meaning way higher prices for Honduran families. And so when Hondurans have said, enough is enough, we can't do this anymore, we don't want these policies in place, our daily living costs have significantly increased. We don't have health care anymore. We have to pay higher fees for our kids to go to school. We can't do this anymore. We want to change our reality. So when they went to the polls in 2017 to try and change their government that would then change these policies, they were told, nope, by the U.S. government, we're going to allow this fraud to happen. We're going to allow this government that doesn't have any legitimacy stay in power. We're going to ignore the fact that there was widespread fraud, and we're going to prop up a government that Hondurans have said they don't want. And so Hondurans, in so many situations, that are no longer able to deal with the daily reality, that when they try and protest, they get shot at, they get tear gas fired at them. They've said, you know what? Well, if we can't vote in our elections, then we're going to vote with our feet. And they start walking to the U.S. border. And it's very unfortunate that that discussion is not happening in the U.S. corporate media about this is why people are fleeing. They can't deal with the daily reality in the country, and they can't fight to change the daily reality, because they get sent to maximum security prisons, they get killed, they get, shot at on the streets, and so therefore they have no choice. There's no options for the Honduran people, and that's in large part because of the U.S. support towards the government. And I just want to talk about who is the United States propping up in Honduras? What kind of government are they supporting? And I've already talked about the fact that this current government was elected by, through a fraudulent electoral process. But the United States ally in the region is actually a corrupt narco mafia government. And what do I mean when I say that? And what does that actually mean? Okay, so I'm going to give examples. So I say it's corrupt, and I'm gonna give you some examples of that. I say it's a mafia. So I already sort of mentioned how they have key people in very specific positions, and I'm going to talk about key people in very specific positions inside the government. That basically means that key people in the government, like the president or the president's brother and his family members, can traffic drugs, They can steal public money and nothing happens to them because they have key people inside the investigative bodies of the government and in the judicial bodies, so in the court system, that stop any sort of efforts to receive any sort of justice process or to bring any of those people to any sort of levels of accountability. So I'm going to give an example as to why I say the United States ally in Honduras is a corrupt narco-trafficking government. So, and this isn't just me saying this. This is actually the New York Southern District Court currently has the brother, of the current president. His name is, the brother of the current president's name is Juan Antonio Hernandez. He's the brother of the current president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, and he's in jail in New York. And he's accused of trafficking drugs to the United States and illegally trafficking arms to the United States, and then lying to U.S. authorities about it. So Tony Hernandez, his trial starts in October, and he's being accused of not only being a low-level drug trafficker, but a very high-level drug trafficker. And as we say in Spanish, he's like a capo, like he's the highest, he's one of the largest drug traffickers in Honduras and in the Central American region. And these are all things that are being said in these court documents coming out of the New York Southern District Court. And so in the Southern District Court, too, they're saying that they're calling Juan Orlando Hernandez, the president of Honduras, a CC4 or co-conspirator 4. So he's named, the brother of Tony Hernandez, is the president of Honduras, is also being named as a co-conspirator of trafficking drugs and arms to the United States as well. And so is the former president. They're all part of the National Party that have been in power since the 2009 coup. But former President Pepe Lobo is also being called a co-conspirator in trafficking drugs and arms to the United States in this New York Southern District Court case. And so that's why I call the government of Honduras a narco government. And no, why is it a mafia government? Why is it a corrupt government? I'm going to give you some more examples. So the son of the former president, Pepe Lobo, who's named as a co-conspirator in this New York case, his son Fabio Lobo, has been convicted and found guilty, and he's sentenced to 24 years in prison in the United States for trafficking drugs as well, and taking advantage of the fact that he was the son of the former president, and he used his position to be able to traffic these drugs into the United States. And that's the same with Tony Hernandez, and same with President Hernandez, that they use their positions in these powerful positions to traffic drugs into the United States in total impunity. And Ramon Lobo is the brother of the former president of Honduras, and he was accused of stealing millions of dollars of public money in Honduras for his own personal benefit and depositing that directly into his personal bank account. The wife of the former president of Honduras, Pepe Lobo, her name is Rosa Elena de Lobo. She was just sentenced to 58 years in prison for stealing millions of dollars from a social program that was designed to purchase shoes for poor families and for poor children in Honduras. So instead of taking that money and distributing it and giving it to poor people in Honduras as it was supposed to be, Rosa Elena de Lobo took millions of dollars of that money and deposited into her personal account and purchased houses, nice luxury clothing with it, and did it in absolute and total impunity as well. And so, the mafia is appropriating or taking over all these different sectors of the Honduran government. And Juan Orlando Hernandez himself has placed his allies that are implicated in corruption and implicated in drug trafficking in very key positions inside the courts and inside the investigative structures of the government, so that no investigations proceed against this mafia that is controlling the Honduran government and that has controlled the Honduran government for the last 10 years. And during those 10 years has received millions of dollars of U.S. taxpayers' dollars of support, whether it's for purchasing guns, purchasing bullets to open fire at protesters that stay in Honduras to try and change their reality, or they're purchasing uniforms for military and police in Honduras, or they are, or it's a political support that they're giving, saying, President Trump and President Obama all came out saying and talking about how Honduran government is such an important U.S. ally, when really, in fact, the United States government has propped up an illegal, corrupt mafia government that traffic drugs for years in Honduras. And it's interesting because the United States government has justified sending millions of dollars in U.S. taxpayers' dollars to Honduras, saying that they're fighting drug trafficking and they're fighting organized crime. But really what they were doing was propping up a drug trafficking cartel that had taken over the Honduran government. And so that's why people flee. They're fleeing a government that is a narco-mafia government that doesn't allow for Hondurans to protest, that doesn't allow Hondurans to stay in Honduras and change their own reality, that's pushing Hondurans to the U.S. border, and that's being propped up by the United States government. And so that's why people are fleeing, and it's something that you never hear discussed in the U.S. Press. And so I just want to talk a bit about, because one of the things that we do as the Honduras Solidarity Network is we talk about, okay, so this is what's going on in Honduras. Now, what can we do in the United States and Canada to support this amazing work that Hondurans are doing to try and change the reality to stay in Honduras, to address the root causes as to why people are leaving Honduras? And I mentioned already this outstanding activist, Berta Cáceres, the environmental indigenous activist who was murdered in her home. It's interesting because the Honduras Solidarity Network, along with all these amazing folks in the United States, have managed to get a law presented in the U.S. Congress called the Berta Cáceres Human Rights Act. That is calling for the United States government to suspend security aid to the Honduran government while the Honduran government continues to commit widespread human rights violations. And so this is a way, if we can get this law, if we can get support from our congressional representatives and our senators to support this bill and to support this idea, we're actually going to be supporting creating spaces for Hondurans to protest. Because if we cut security aid to the Honduran government, well, they're not going to be able to purchase more guns and tear gas and bullets and weapons to repress the Hondurans that are trying to stay in the streets and trying to change and push for a better government that better represents their interests. And so the Berta Cáceres Human Rights Act in Congress, in the U.S. Congress, says that, okay, we're going to suspend security aid until a certain level of conditions are met. And one of those conditions is justice for Berta Cáceres and other human rights cases that are very important human rights cases. And so it's not only talking about suspending security aid, but it's also talking about dealing with corruption and dealing with the widespread impunity in the country. The impunity that allows for perpetrators of violence and corruption and threats and murders of activists and human rights defenders to basically commit these crimes in total impunity. And so the Berta Cáceres Human Rights Act is asking for there to be a series of steps made in a justice process for a different number of human rights cases. So I highly encourage people in the United States to call their congresspeople and to have that conversation with them about this bill, this Berta Cáceres Act in Congress. And it's a way that we as U.S. and Canadian citizens can basically change our policies. Here, the problem, Hondurans need to stay in Honduras and protest and have the right to stay in their country and protest and define their own government, define their own reality, define what kind of development they want, and basically control their own reality in their own country. Whereas we as Canadian and U.S. citizens have to stay focused on our policies in Canada and the United States that are preventing Hondurans from doing that. And so we need to work with our congressional representatives and our communities to address the root causes of migration and to have these conversations about how our policies in Canada and the United States are actually causing Hondurans to flee their country. And we, as Americans and Canadians, are actually creating the root causes for migration. And until we change those, the U.S. policy towards Honduras, Hondurans are going to keep having to flee their own country and make that difficult decision and make that difficult journey to the border. And so I wanted to thank everybody. I'm going to close it down there. I want to thank everybody for coming to the event. Thank you for being so understanding about me not being present there in person. I hope to return to California, the Bay Area again soon to do more presentations in person. If people are interested in information about Honduras, the Honduras Solidarity Network has a Facebook page that is updated daily that focuses on the role of the U.S. and Canada in Honduras. It's called Honduras Solidarity Network. We're also on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is at Honduras SOL, and so people can check us out on Twitter as well. And there's a lot of local groups in California that are doing great work, solidarity work that also people in California can connect into. So the Task Force of the Americas is based in California, and they have organized events. They organize delegations to Honduras for people that want to go and talk to Hondurans, hear about the daily reality that Hondurans are living. They organize those types of delegations, so you can also get in touch with them. I think their website is taskforceamericas.org. So thank you very much, everyone. I can be reached at Karen, Karen, at HondurasSOL.org. If anybody has any questions or are looking for more resources about what I spoke about, I'm happy to provide those over email. Thank you very much for the space, and have a great day, everybody.